started 2 years ago, though in reality, the betrayal stretched back much further. I had found out about her cheating by accident, in the most unexpected way. I was preparing an old cell phone to pass down to our oldest child, figuring it would be a nice hand-me-down. As I went through it, clearing out old data, I came across a note that stopped me cold. In that note, there was an email and a password. Something about it felt off, so I followed my gut. I logged in, and the account wasn't hers. Not the version of her I knew. This was something entirely different. A fake persona she had created. But what I found next tore my world apart. The email was linked to a Craigslist account where she had posted ads. Explicit ads, selling herself for money. There were countless exchanges with men, explicit pictures, and arrangements being made. She had been pregnant with our second child when this was going on. The betrayal wasn't just emotional or physical. It cut so much deeper than that. There were dozens of conversations, 15, maybe 20 men, all chatting with her, arranging meetups. There were pictures too, the kind of intimate photos she had never sent me. In those moments, I could hardly breathe. My mind was racing, my heart pounding as I tried to process what I was seeing. My wife, the mother of my children, had been living a life I knew nothing about. And it wasn't just a one-time mistake. It had gone on for months, right under my nose. I confronted her that night. I don't think I'll ever forget the way she reacted, cool, almost detached. She didn't cry, didn't beg for forgiveness. Instead, she blamed her pregnancy, claiming that pregnancy brain had clouded her judgment. It was as if she wanted me to believe that she wasn't responsible for her actions, that it was all a blur to her. I wanted to scream at her, to shake her out of her indifference, but part of me was weak. I let it go. I told myself that it had happened years ago and that maybe, just maybe, it was a moment of temporary insanity. We had a rocky marriage, sure, but I had been willing to fight for it. We tried counseling, but after one session, she refused to go back. We moved on, sort of. Our relationship was never the same, but I buried the hurt. I had kids to think about. I told myself I was doing it for them. Fast forward to just 3 weeks ago. I thought I had put all of that behind me, buried in the past where it belonged. But the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deep you try to hide it. This time, it wasn't an old phone that revealed her lies. It was a person, one of her ex-friends. Someone she had stopped speaking to over the years reached out to me. She told me she couldn't carry the weight of my wife's lies any longer. The friend confessed everything. All the affairs, all the betrayals. She had stopped being friends with my wife because she couldn't keep covering for her anymore. Apparently, my wife had used this woman as an alibi, lying about where she was going, who she was seeing, while she snuck away to meet her lovers. There were so many, too many. There was the guy from the dispensary, a guy she'd met back in 2019 and became obsessed with. They had an affair for months before he found out about me and ended it. She wrote about him in her journal, fantasizing about the life they could have had together. She even admitted to meeting up with him once after they had supposedly ended things. I found his full name written in her journal, along with detailed accounts of their time together. It was sickening. Then there was her former coworker. That affair lasted 6 to 8 months while I was home taking care of our children, thinking she was working late or catching up with friends. She had a pattern, always the same lies, the same stories, and it worked. I had believed every word of it. And finally, the most recent betrayal. The man she had met on Bumble. They had been together for 2 years, sneaking away on overnight camping trips, hiking adventures, all while she pretended to be the perfect wife and mother. She had used that same ex-friend as a cover, making up elaborate stories about where she was going. When I confronted her this time, it was different. I was ready for the lies. At first, she denied everything, of course. She swore up and down that the ex-friend was lying, that the journal entries were fake. She even tried to claim the evidence I had found had been doctored somehow, that I had imagined the whole thing. But there was no getting out of this one. Eventually, when I showed her more evidence, she caved, sort of. She admitted to some of it, but not all. Always half-truths, always just enough to try and wriggle her way out of the mess she had created. I had heard enough. I handed her divorce papers on Monday. Later, I reached out to her ex-friend, the woman who had blown the lid off my wife's secret life. Her name was Rachel, and although we had never been particularly close, I knew she had been a part of our social circle for years. When she first contacted me, I didn't trust her completely. After all, why would someone come forward now after years of silence? But as we talked more, I realized that Rachel wasn't just another pawn in my wife's game. She had been a victim too. Rachel had been one of my wife's closest friends for years, the kind of friend who had been there through thick and thin. They had shared secrets, covered for each other, and spent countless nights together. But Rachel had drawn a line when it came to the lying. She had tried to confront my wife about the affairs, tried to make her stop, but my wife had always brushed her off, laughing about how men are so easy to fool. Rachel had finally had enough. She stopped covering for her and cut ties, unwilling to be a part of the mess any longer. That's why she had come to me. Guilt had been eating away at her for months, and she needed to clear her conscience. As she told me more, I realized that Rachel had insight into my wife's behavior that I never could have had. She knew about the lies, the alibis, the fake stories my wife had spun for years. And as much as it hurt to hear, I realized Rachel might be the key to my plan. We met in a small coffee shop a few days after I filed for divorce. I was nervous, unsure of how the conversation would go. But when I saw the look in Rachel's eyes, determination mixed with regret, I knew she was on my side. "I should have come to you sooner," Rachel said, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. I didn't want to believe it myself. I thought maybe she'd change, that maybe this was just a phase, but it wasn't. "I get it," I said, though the words felt hollow. I didn't really get it. I didn't understand how someone could watch my wife destroy our family and not say something. But at the same time, I knew what it was like to be manipulated by her. I had fallen for her lies for years. How could I expect someone else to have done any better? "I want to help you," Rachel said suddenly, leaning forward. "I want to expose her. She's hurt too many people, and I'm done watching her get away with it." I sat back, considering her offer. Part of me wanted to move on, to leave all of this behind and focus on rebuilding my life. But a larger part of me, the part that had been betrayed, humiliated, and dragged through the mud, wanted revenge. And Rachel had just handed me the perfect opportunity. "How?" I asked, curious to hear her plan. Rachel smiled, a small satisfied grin that told me she had been thinking about this for a long time. She spent years weaving this web of lies, manipulating people, covering her tracks. But now she's exposed, we can use that. We'll unravel everything piece by piece. I know the men she's been seeing, and I know how to reach them. We can set up confrontations, show them who she really is. I leaned in, intrigued. "Confrontations?" Rachel nodded. "She's been playing all of them just like she played you. They think they're special, that they're the only one. But if we bring them all together, make them realize she's been lying to all of them, her entire world will fall apart." It was a bold plan and risky, but as Rachel laid out the details, I could see how it might work. My wife had built her life on secrets and manipulation. If we could pull back the curtain and show everyone the truth, she wouldn't just lose her lovers. She'd lose her reputation, her credibility, everything. "What about her journal?" I asked, remembering the detailed entries I had found about the men she'd been seeing. "I have names, dates, everything." Rachel's eyes lit up. "That's perfect. We can use that to track them down. Let them know what's really been going on. I'm sure they'll want to confront her once they realize they've been lied to." As we talked more, the plan began to take shape. It wasn't just about exposing the affairs. It was about creating a chain reaction that would unravel everything she had built. Each confrontation would chip away at her carefully crafted image until there was nothing left but the truth. But there was more to it than just revenge. As Rachel and I continued to meet and plan, something unexpected started to happen. I began to feel something for her, something I hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't just gratitude for her help. It was something deeper. She understood what I had been through in a way no one else could. She had been there, seen the lies firsthand, and had chosen to stand with me. We spent hours together, not just plotting my wife's downfall, but talking, really talking, about life, about betrayal, about moving on. Rachel was funny, smart, and empathetic in a way I hadn't experienced in years. And slowly, I found myself drawn to her, not just as an ally but as a person. At first, I pushed those feelings aside, telling myself it was just the adrenaline of the situation, the shared pain of betrayal that was bringing us closer. But the more time we spent together, the more I realized it wasn't just about that. Rachel and I were connected in a way I hadn't expected. Still, I kept my focus on the plan. There would be time to explore those feelings later, once the dust had settled. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of preparation. Rachel tracked down the men my wife had been seeing, arranging for them to meet, while I gathered more evidence. With each step, we were getting closer to the moment of truth, the moment when everything would come crashing down. Rachel had tracked down 3 key men from my wife's affairs: the guy from Bumble, the coworker, and the man from the dispensary. Each of them had their own stories, their own reasons for being involved with her, but none of them knew the full extent of her betrayal until now. We decided to stage the confrontations in public places, neutral ground, where they wouldn't be able to simply walk away or deny what was happening. Rachel had reached out to each man individually, pretending to be a friend of my wife who was concerned about the lies she was telling. She played it perfectly, just enough truth to pique their interest, just enough mystery to make them want to show up. The first confrontation took place at a local park. It was a quiet spot where my wife had apparently met the Bumble guy multiple times for their little camping trips. The man, a rugged outdoorsy type, arrived first, looking confused but curious. Rachel and I watched from a distance, waiting. My wife arrived a few minutes later, completely unaware that her carefully constructed world was about to implode. As she approached him, the man asked the question Rachel had fed him: "Is it true? Have you been lying to me this whole time?" The look on her face was priceless. For a split second, I saw the mask slip, the shock, the fear. She quickly recovered, of course, trying to play it off, saying she didn't know what he was talking about. But the man had been primed. Rachel had given him enough information to know that something was off, and he wasn't buying her excuses anymore. "Why didn't you tell me you were married?" he pressed, his voice rising. "Why didn't you tell me about him?" My wife stammered, her usual cool demeanor faltering as she tried to control the situation. But this time, it wasn't working. She was on the defensive, and I could see her starting to panic. She had always been good at manipulating people, but now her lies were catching up to her, and there was no way out. The second confrontation happened at a nearby cafe, where Rachel had arranged for the ex-coworker to meet my wife. He was a bit older, well-dressed, clearly someone who had believed her lies about being in an unhappy marriage. Rachel had primed him with information from my wife's journal, showing him exactly what my wife had been saying behind his back. When he confronted her, it was like watching a slow-motion train wreck. My wife tried to laugh it off, calling the journal entries private thoughts that didn't mean anything. But when he pulled out the screenshots Rachel had given him, showing her messages to other men during the time they were together, there was nothing left for her to say. I didn't take any pleasure in watching her squirm. Not really. But there was a sense of justice, a feeling that finally, after all these years of her manipulating and lying, the truth was coming to light. She had spent so long believing she was untouchable, that she could have it all without consequences. But now those consequences were hitting her like a freight train. The final confrontation was the most explosive. It happened at the same dispensary where she had first met the man she had been infatuated with. He was the one who had pulled away from her when he found out she was married. But even after that, she had kept him on the hook, meeting up with him occasionally, feeding him lies about how her marriage was over. Rachel had arranged for all 3 men to be there at the same time, under the pretense that they were coming to clear things up with my wife. None of them knew about each other, and that was exactly how we wanted it. I watched from across the street as they gathered, each one looking confused, each one trying to figure out what was going on. Then my wife showed up. I don't know what she thought was happening when she saw all 3 of them standing there, but the moment she realized who they were, her face drained of color. For a few seconds, she just stood there, frozen in place, unable to speak. And then the questions started flying. "How long have you been lying to me? Did you ever care about me? Or was I just another one of your toys? Why didn't you tell me about the others? Her usual tactics, charming her way out, deflecting, manipulating, weren't working this time. The men were angry, hurt, and they weren't letting her off the hook. As they pressed her, her carefully constructed web of lies began to unravel in real time, right in front of them. She tried to deny it, of course, but they had too much evidence now. Rachel had made sure of that. The meltdown that followed was unlike anything I'd ever seen. My wife, who had always prided herself on being in control and manipulating people with ease, was completely unraveling. She was crying, shouting, trying to explain herself, but none of it made sense. None of it mattered. The truth was out, and there was no putting it back in the box. People in the dispensary were starting to stare. The spectacle of my wife standing there, being confronted by multiple lovers at once, was too much for her to handle. She tried to leave, but one of the men grabbed her arm, demanding answers. It wasn't violent, but it was tense. She yanked her arm away, screaming at them to leave her alone, and then she saw me. I hadn't planned on revealing myself. I thought I'd watch from the sidelines, let her deal with the fallout, but when our eyes met, something shifted. She knew. She knew this wasn't just a random series of coincidences. This was planned. This was deliberate. She stormed toward me, her face a twisted mix of rage and desperation. "You did this?" she spat, her voice shaking. "You set this all up. I didn't deny it. I didn't need to. You did this to yourself," I said, my voice calm in contrast to her hysteria. "All I did was help them see the truth." She stood there, panting, staring at me like she didn't even recognize me anymore. And maybe she didn't. Maybe I wasn't the same man who had let her manipulate me for years. I had changed, and she wasn't prepared for that. Rachel walked up behind me, placing a hand on my shoulder. It was a subtle gesture, but it said everything. I wasn't alone in this anymore. I had found someone who had seen the truth, who had stood by my side while I took my life back. My wife looked between us, her face a mask of disbelief, as she put the pieces together. The final, cruel twist in all of this was dawning on her. Rachel and I weren't just allies. We were together now. Her voice cracked as she took a step back, looking at Rachel with a mixture of hurt and betrayal. You're with him?" Rachel didn't flinch. She met my wife's gaze head-on, her voice steady. "I'm done with your lies. We both are." And that was it. My wife stood there, broken, surrounded by the wreckage of her own deceit. There was nothing left for her to say. No more lies to spin, no more games to play. She was exposed, and this time there was no way out. The fallout from the public confrontation was immediate and brutal. Rachel and I kept our distance from the chaos, but it was impossible not to hear about what was happening. Mutual friends reached out, some to express their shock, others to try and understand how things had gotten so bad. A few were sympathetic to me, but most were just curious. They wanted the inside scoop on the collapse of her perfect facade. I didn't give them much, just enough to let them know that the woman they thought they knew was not who she had claimed to be. My wife, on the other hand, was spiraling. She was losing everything. The men she had juggled so skillfully before were now furious with her, refusing to have anything to do with her after learning they had all been played. Her reputation was in tatters, her social circle dwindling as people distanced themselves from the scandal. I heard through the grapevine that she had tried to reach out to a few friends, but no one wanted to be associated with her anymore. It was like watching someone slowly unravel, bit by bit. Every pillar of her life was crumbling, and for once she couldn't charm or manipulate her way out of it. The walls were closing in. One evening, about a week after the confrontation, I received a text from her. It was simple, desperate, and completely unlike her. "Can we talk?" I stared at the message for a while, debating whether or not to respond. Part of me wanted to ignore it. After everything she had done, she didn't deserve the courtesy of a conversation. But another part of me, maybe the part that had once loved her, was curious. What could she possibly have to say now that everything was out in the open? I ended up not responding. Rachel and I had spent so much time unraveling the lies, piecing together the evidence, and plotting the perfect revenge. Somewhere in the midst of that, something deeper had grown between us. What had started as an alliance of convenience had turned into a connection neither of us had anticipated. Rachel understood me in a way no one else ever had. She had been there, seen the worst of my wife's deceit, and stood by my side when the truth finally came to light. She hadn't judged me for my weaknesses or for the times I had let my wife's lies consume me. Instead, she had offered me strength, support, and eventually love. Our relationship started off slow. We didn't rush things. Both of us knew that jumping into something too quickly could be a mistake, especially after everything that had happened. But with each passing day, it became clearer that what we had was real. The late-night conversations, the shared meals, the quiet moments where we didn't need to say anything at all. It all felt right.